Welcome to episode 133 of Video 815, the podcast dedicated to discussing the work of writer director J.J. Abrams and his greater Bad Robot universe. I'm your host for this week. My name is Marcelo Inostroza, joined as always by my fellow co-host, Matt Crandall. And on today's show, we'll be talking about one of J.J.'s earlier works. We'll be talking about the film that he co-wrote, starring Joe Pesci and Danny Glover, entitled Gone Fishin' from 1997. So, Matt, I simply want to ask, do you want to go fishing?
I definitely do not want to go fishing with Gus and whatever the fuck the other guy's name was, because I gotta tell you, if you are new to this podcast, we are talking about J.J. Abrams' work. We have already covered the great stuff: Felicity, Alias, Lost, Fringe. You can go back. We've got rewatches of those. We tackled some of his earlier film work. We did Regarding Henry, the Harrison Ford melodrama about a lawyer who gets shot in the head and turns from a bastard into a nice guy. We did Taking Care of Business with Jim Belushi, about a guy who impersonates another guy and steps into his life. Really high concept movies that when I tell you the pitch, you're like, I can see how this would be a movie. When you hear the pitch for Gone Fishin', which is, what if Roger Murtaugh and Leo Getz from Lethal Weapon were cast into a low-grade Dumb and Dumber and were two idiots who just wanted to go fishing? What the fuck is this movie and how did this get made? Because there's literally nothing on paper that makes it sound appealing, and it's a movie that was so poorly received that up until this point, J.J. Abrams was billed on screen as Jeffrey Abrams. From this point afterwards, he changed his on-screen credit to J.J. Abrams to get the fuck away from the stink that is coming off of Gone Fishin'. And it's fascinating to me because it does feel like a Dumb and Dumber ripoff. These guys are morons. And you're like, how have they gotten by? And they have an element of, ironically, there was a movie that Danny Glover is in with Martin Short called Pure Luck, where Martin Short has like the worst luck. Well, these guys also have like this really bad luck streak where like random stuff starts happening that's just bad luck, but it happens to work out kind of in their favor. And so it's bizarre as you're watching this movie that it tries to work in like a murderous thief who's kind of crossing their paths and all this danger into this story of two morons who just love to go fishing once a year. But they are played. Joe Pesci has never been more annoying. And I love Joe Pesci. Goodfellas, My Cousin Vinny, Home Alone. I love that the guy can dial into that annoying thing, but make it be like the character trait that works. And in this, you're just like, what in the hell? But in all fairness to JJ and Jill Mazursky, his co-writer, I don't know if they even used the script once they got on set for this movie. Marcelo, do you think this is actually everything that was scripted? Or is this a movie that JJ and Jill scripted out, like they go to a diner, they have an encounter, they go to this place, they have an encounter, and then everything that actually takes place is just like loose improv, seat of their pants, they chucked the script out, they just kept rolling on this shit?
No, you know what? I was sitting watching this movie in preparation for this conversation, and I couldn't believe what I was watching. Because number one, I love Joe Pesci, and I love Danny Glover as well. But I couldn't believe how bad the dialogue was, and I couldn't believe how bad Joe Pesci was. And just the character constructions of these two guys that just want to go fishing, they're so fucking stupid and so inept that I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe it. Some of the things that happen to them are cool. Like when they get, when their boat gets unstuck from a car that was giving them a ride back to town, and they somehow end up on a fucking train track. Like one moment they're in the goddamn middle of the street, and the next moment they're in the middle of a train track. I'm like, that's kind of funny. But as you guys can hear me, I'm straining for positive things to say. So I don't know what could have compelled JJ and his writing partner to go, this is a good idea. Let's do this.
Yeah, and it's weird because, they teamed up first for Taking Care of Business. And that movie still is a really funny, charming, fish out of water pick, buoyed by the fact that Charles Grodin and Jim Belushi are so great. And this is a movie where, like, on paper, you'd be like, Danny Glover and Joe Pesci, this is going to work. Because we've also seen them in, at this point, 2 Lethal Weapons together. They would do another one right after this. That you're like, these guys have, like, a good rapport. They can make it work. And even in those movies, Pesci is playing the annoying guy to Danny Glover's, like, I'm getting too old for this shit kind of character. But here, it never really gels. And even though there are some funny moments, because yeah, it is kind of funny when they are being towed by Rosanna Arquette and her partner, and then they end up on these train tracks. And then later people see the boat go across the train and they're like, what the hell happened here? I like some of those moments, but they feel like Dumb and Dumber was a big hit and they were like, we gotta try and cash in on this fad of like 2 idiots on a road trip who get caught up in some sort of scheme. And like, there's a lot of movies about idiots who get caught up in a scheme around this same time. Bill Murray, The Man Who Knew Too Little, came out, I think, the same year. What's wild is that, so JJ and Jill signed a 3-picture deal. This is the second of the 3. And afterwards, Hollywood Pictures Touchdown was just like, fuck it, we're not doing another one. And it makes sense. Originally, this movie was going to be directed by John Avildsen. John Avildsen directed Rocky, the Karate Kid. I have no idea how the hell he signed on for this movie. And after 2 weeks of filming, he was fired. They got rid of him. And they replaced him with this gun for hire guy, Christopher Cain. And this movie went over budget. It shot longer than it was supposed to. It ended up costing, buckle up, you will never believe it, $53 million. In 1996 dollars. That's like $100 million comedy nowadays, which would never be made because it wouldn't be possible. But knowing that this movie cost that much and that they had an actual great director, and it's funny because John Avildsen directed The Karate Kid and he started to direct the next Karate Kid with Hilary Swank, and he was also fired off of that movie. And the guy who finished that movie is the same guy who finished this movie. So John Avildsen was fired off of 2 movies, and the same fucking guy came in and directed those movies instead. And both of those movies are fucking terrible. And if they had let the director of Rocky maybe do them, they might have actually been salvageable. But in past, Glover and Pesci have both said they hated making this movie. They were trapped and they only did it for the money, which is obvious as you're watching this. And so I'm wondering, even at the scripting phase, do we think JJ really put his all into writing this? Or was it more they just thought, let's get this done. We'll punch it up as we go. But then the production was so fraught that they probably weren't on set every day working on this thing. And it was just like a let's just shoot this out and get it done with kind of deal. I will say there are a few funny lines at times. So I think some of those might be scripted. My favorite part of the entire movie comes early. So it's bizarre that these guys caused the gigantic blackout in New York in the 70s. And then we jump forward and we see that they're still causing shit by just being complete idiots. They stop at a diner on their fishing trip. And the guy who's sitting behind them is like our bad guy for the movie. And he interjects. And when he's trying to get to know them before he steals their car, he goes, so you guys are professional fishermen? And they're like, well, we're like semi-pro. And he goes, are you married? And Joe Pesci goes, yeah. And the bad guy goes, children? And Joe Pesci goes, no, our wives are our age. They're normal. And I was like, that was the funniest part, where Joe Pesci thought if the guy was asking if they had married children instead of normal, appropriately aged women. And I thought that was like the only like really clever moment. There's a few back and forth moments like that sprinkled throughout, like when they have a dinner at a restaurant, but they are few and far between. And even some of the crazy, like, zany things and the way they get wrapped up with this murderer are not as clever as a movie like Dumb and Dumber, where Harry and Lloyd are stumbling through and just too stupid to realize that they are screwing up a money exchange and a kidnapping moment. So I just feel like this movie at the time, 97 is when it opened. It was delayed multiple times. This kind of low concept but big star power comedy was kind of the norm. Studios would drop these into theaters and they would do okay, but centering a movie around fishing seemed like such an odd thing. Marcelo, do you give a crap about fishing? And how many movies about fishing can we even name? It's a very small genre.
I don't I don't care about fishing, to put it nicely. But a movie about fishing, like, I can't name any. Like, I was thinking, if if you're a certain age, you do remember that John Candy movie, Summer Rental, and in that movie he actually goes fishing, like, in a boat. But I don't know any movies other than this one that are revolve around fishing in specifically. So I can't think of any.
Well, and yeah, as you mentioned, even Candy and Aykroyd, The Great Outdoors. Also, a movie like A River Runs Through It. There's like some fly fishing scenes, but it's rare that you center a movie on a fishing trip. And they don't do much fishing in this movie because fishing is decidedly uncinematic, right? Like, it's just dudes sitting in a boat for hours waiting for something to happen. So it's strange that, in other JJ things, they were all such high concepts. Mel Gibson is in World War II and he accidentally gets locked into a chamber and wakes up in modern times. And you're like, oh, okay. That sounds like something there. And even after this, all right, what's your next project? Well, it's about an asteroid that's going to destroy the Earth and we have to send miners up to drill into the thing to stop this apocalypse from happening. You're like, oh, okay, that sounds like a high concept thing. What was your movie before that? Two fucking idiots go on a fishing trip and they happen to bumble into a murderer and they end up taking him down, sort of. So it's like, okay, are we sure this was the best call?
No, I mean, look, half of me really believes. Again, I don't know any of the history behind this movie. Matt has filled us in with some of it throughout this episode, but half of me believes that this idea was birthed from his co-writer, and as they were a writing team at the time, he was like, okay, I'll help you do this. But I don't think that his heart was in this at all, because like I said in my earlier comments, this movie's dialogue is so goddamn bad. And I'm like, JJ has made some mistakes in his career, of which I won't mention here because we'll talk about that at some point. But the one thing that JJ doesn't do bad, at least not on purpose, is bad dialogue. And this was just bad reading, bad situations. It was just, it felt like somebody came up with scene ideas and said, okay, this is going to happen, and this is going to happen. But there was no flow to anything of it. There was no flow to any of it. It just happened because it needed to happen.
I agree. And especially because usually when we would do these movie-centric episodes, we might almost go like act by act and dissect what happens in the movie, or scene by scene and talk about how the structure or the dialogue brings the scene to life. And frankly, this movie, it's like impossible to do that because very little happens of any actual value or any actual note, and it would just become tedious. So like, for anybody who's listened this far, thank you. Thank you. We don't want to just shit on one of our favorite writer-directors working, but this just shows that when you are starting out and you are trying to build up a resume, sometimes you do stuff that just doesn't work. And this movie specifically is notorious for being over budget, overblown. Everyone making it was miserable. It didn't turn out the way anyone wanted it to. And then it opened and tanked and is a notorious flop. So it's tough for us to examine it from a writing craft perspective, because what's on the screen doesn't show hardly any craft. Even the characters at the end are basically the same as they were at the start. These guys don't learn anything along this journey. I didn't feel like they realized that their bumbling idiocy got them into this mess, and if they would stop being complete morons, they might have a better life, and maybe they should stop these fishing trips. And it's funny when their family knows they're leaving and they're just like, see ya, don't let the door hit you on the way out. I'm like, yeah, of course. I'm sure this is the best week of that family's life without this annoying idiot father hanging around. So it's tough to go on and on about this movie without just being kind of a pile on. And it's the kind of movie that, like, I sat down ready to give it my full attention, and at about an hour in, you're just like, where's my fucking phone? I gotta do something. I gotta second screen this shit. I can't just be watching Gone Fishing right now. Life is too short.
The other thing that really annoyed me from a character perspective and from a writing perspective, I don't know if this was in the actual script or if this was something that Joe Pesci and Danny Glover added, but like every time these two guys would have a conversation with each other, they would say each other's names like 50 fucking times. I'm like, why do you, like, nobody does that. Nobody like nobody does that. Like, they would say, hey Joe, or hey whatever the other guy's name was, 50 goddamn times. I'm like, why are you doing that? We already know your goddamn names. It annoyed the crap out of me. One positive thing that I thought was a cool scene. It was just really cool to see Danny Glover acting all stupid and setting the hotel on fire. That was my highlight of the film, watching Danny Glover pretend to be asleep and setting the hotel on fire. But even as these guys are going through this ridiculousness for this fishing trip, everything that they do, there are no consequences for anything that they do. They cause all this damage throughout all this movie. They never get arrested. They never get questioned by anybody. They never pay for anything that they do. It's like they're bumbling idiots and the world forgives them for everything. I'm like, you can't write a story like that. There has to be some consequences to something here.
Yeah, like literally there is no character growth. They don't learn anything, and because there is no consequences to what happens. And I had read this earlier, so I had to look it up because you mentioned it. Someone went through and counted. So Danny Glover says Joe, which is Joe Pesci's name, 188 times in the movie. Joe Pesci says Gus, Danny Glover's character's name, 227 times in the movie, which is unfucking believable. Because, yeah, literally every line, it's like, hey, Gus, what if we did this, Gus? Hey, Gus, what if we did this, Gus? And you're like, why? Why are you doing this to your audience? And also of note, and I think this might speak to why, someone like JJ did a movie like this. It was at one point planned that Travolta was going to be one of the stars. So it was going to actually be like A-list. But the big thing originally attached was John Candy and Rick Moranis. But Candy died. And so when John Candy died, then obviously Rick Moranis retired right after that. And so he wasn't going to make a movie that he was going to do with his buddy if his buddy was no longer here. And I think even with this script, there's probably a version that if those two guys had been the stars, even if it was a stupid movie, I bet it would have been way funnier. I bet they could have actually made it somehow into not a comedy classic, but certainly something entertaining that you wouldn't be mad if it was on cable and you were flipping around and you would stop and watch it. But as much as I love Pesci and Glover, they are not a John Candy and Rick Moranis comedic duo. That's not their vibe. So it blows my mind thinking that, especially if that was sort of the original intention when JJ and Jill wrote this, if they were writing it as a Candy Moranis vehicle, you wouldn't actually need to put a lot of thought and effort into the dialogue because those two guys are going to just on the day bring that shit to life. And the guys that they got are not guys who are going to bring that shit to life. And if they're going to improv, it's going to be Gus, I don't like fish, Gus. You can have my potatoes, Gus. And it's like, oh my God, what the?
Right. And you mentioned JJ's next project after this, but you also have to mention the very next year, JJ created this show that sort of introduced him to the world, at least to me and to you. He created a little show called Felicity, and I'm like, the guy that wrote Felicity did this? Like, what the hell? Like, just where I can look for my money, JJ's Bad Day at the Office is that Star Wars movie that we're not going to talk about today, but this comes in a close second because I can't believe that my favorite writer director working today did this, and I completely I completely understand why he changed his name from his legal name to what we know him today as J.J. Abrams. I get it, because if I did this project, I would want to get away from it as quickly as humanly possible.
The main distinction is that this is a failure that I don't think we would lay at JJ's feet. It's not the script's fault that this movie is borderline unwatchable. Whereas, as much as that also being a bad situation that you're stepping into, Rise of Skywalker is a movie where the dude wrote, directed, produced, even if he was under ridiculous constraints and time and stuff. That's one where there's no scapegoat for that other than this was JJ's deal, right? As much as I would point to Chris Terrio as being the wrong guy to be in the room. But this is one where it's like the dude gets a pass. The dude gets a pass on this thing, especially because everything after this feels more like stuff he's actually invested in. So even, Armageddon has his fingerprints all over it, even in the sentimentality and the way that movie is big spectacle, but characters with heart, which would be like his trademark going on. Something that we'll also talk about shortly on this podcast, like Joyride, that's a thriller, but you can still sort of feel some of his DNA in that, especially because it is very Spielberg-esque, like Spielberg's Duel, and knowing that Spielberg was such an influence on JJ, that all aligns and makes sense. But everything pre doesn't really feel like the guy was writing stuff that he cared that much about. Taking Care of Business just feels like a guy trying to get his foot in the door. Regarding Henry has a couple of good character beat moments that would echo, character beats that he would do on his TV shows. And Forever Young is about as close to the J.J. Abrams feel that he gets in those early days, where it's high sci-fi concept in a real world situation with characters, Spielberg-esque characters. And that's something that he would carry on. So I do feel like all of these early works are the training wheels so that he's learning how to ride the bike, so that finally, when it's time, he will be prepared in a way that, as you said, it is just after this. Armageddon and Felicity are both 98. And I think that's important because Armageddon is the last time he would write a big movie and kind of just be the writer on it. Like a huge movie, because Joyride he wrote, but he didn't do much else. But and then other than that, it was TV until he becomes, when he does Mission 3 and he gets into that like writer director bag, everything he's directed, he has also been really personally involved in the writing. So I think that that's an important distinction, that, Gone Fishin' is also the last time he has just tried an out and out comedy. Everything else is a high concept something, even if it's funny. It's got something else going on that's the main driver, whereas the main driver of this was slapstick comedy, fast talking idiots.
Yeah. You mentioned that this is the last time that he tried, outright comedy, and I was also sitting there thinking, like, as I was trying to wrap my head around this movie for God knows why reason, I was also thinking, like, JJ's bag back then is personal, in-depth character moments. And this movie, two last things I'll say about this movie, didn't have any of that. This movie was like an outright comedy. It was almost like JJ and his writing partner, Jill Mazursky, were sort of testing themselves to see if they could potentially do a comedy. But I think I think when you're a writer just starting out in your career, you have to figure out what you're kind of good at, and then once you figure out what you're good at, you got to make your calling card based on that. And you can't go out of your lane not until you're established as a good writer, not until you have what we call in the writing gig your voice. And I didn't hear JJ's voice, or I didn't see JJ's voice in this movie. The only time that I saw JJ's voice is in the film that me and Matt have brought up several times in this episode, Armageddon. And the thing that is JJ's voice 100%, and JJ from the core up, is Felicity. But this was so far removed from that I'm like, maybe it was him just trying to do something different, but it obviously didn't work.
Yeah, and I think this at the time was what studios were after, was goofy comedies, and it's probably all he could kind of get in the door to get made until he got his hands on something much better and was able to do his own thing. But, we will talk more in the coming weeks about some of those other movies, like your Armageddons and Joyrides, as we get deeper into his career as a writer. Before, we've already covered the big TV shows that really made his name known. But luckily, now is where, like, most of the stuff we talk about after this, I like, or can at least find something likable. But the entire hour and 40 minutes of Gone Fishin' was like a visit to the dentist. I was in pain watching this thing. I hated, other than like 5 minutes of mild entertainment, I was like, oh my God, I can't believe it's not on any of the streaming services I had, so I've paid to rent it, and it was like, why am I doing this to myself? This is torture.
I found this movie through other means. That's all I'll say. But the moment where I lost it is the moment where Joe Pesci starts beating up a alligator for some reason. It was just so. I had lost it way before that, but that's the moment where I go, oh, this conversation is. I gotta figure out something to say, because I just couldn't believe that. But yeah, look, as Matt said, in the coming weeks, we're going to focus more on JJ projects that we actually like, and more projects that he was actually directly involved with. Because if you guys have been here for a while, the last show that we talked about, Fringe, had JJ's involvement early on, but after the early days of Fringe, JJ sort of stepped aside to do other things. So it will be nice to focus on projects that he was directly involved with in the weeks to come. So hopefully you'll be here to join us for that in the weeks to come. But to close out this episode, I would just like to ask Matt if the folks at home want to chat with you about anything having to do with J.J. Abrams or anything else, what will be the place for them to do that on?
I guess on Twitter at Matt Crandall.
And guys, if you want to catch up with me and my misadventures online, you can check me out on Twitter. There I have a link to my link tree that gives you all the links to all the glorious, lovely stuff that I do online. But you can also catch me on Twitter and on Threads at CreekFanatic88. But until next time, for my co-host Matt Crandall, I would just like to say thank you for listening. Thank you, really, guys. We mean it this week. Thank you for listening to us. But until next time, as I say often, we'll talk back soon.
Radio 815 is a Balloonhead Productions presentation in association with Killer Newt Productions.